Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. There's emerging evidence, anecdotally and statistically, that the quarantine is, not surprisingly, putting strains on partnerships. So I invited a former divorce litigator and now mediator to dish out some advice. In particular, she discusses advice for divorced people, married people contemplating a divorce, and single people contemplating getting married. For example, if you're solo and thinking of getting married, do not marry someone you don't want to be quarantined with. In the bonus material, I attempt to explain the divorce rate, which is surprisingly complicated, and what it really means when someone says that 40% of marriages end in divorce. This was taped during the second week of April, during the quarantine. I'm doing remote tapings now. I apologize for the sound quality, but it'll be better in other tapings. I hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get started. Hello, Solo listeners. I want to interrupt for a moment to ask you to join the Solo community. You can go to petermcgraw.org. On the Solo page, there's a contact form. I'm going to be hosting a couple or 3 live Zoom events in May and June, and I want to get you invited to them. We're going to talk about how the podcast is going, get a conversation going among listeners, see how I can serve you better. What is it that you want? What could be improved? What needs to go? All of that. Okay, so go to petermcgraw.org to the Solo page, sign up for the Solo community. Okay, let's get back to the podcast. Thanks so much. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Jennifer Wineston. Jennifer has a JD from the University of Ottawa and a Master's of Law in Dispute Resolution from Pepperdine. She runs Wineston Mediation, which helps families navigate separation, divorce, and child custody. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
So, Jennifer, this is my second ever remote taping of Solo, but I feel like this topic is so important, I might launch it before the prior taping. So congratulations. So the idea of doing a divorce-related podcast has been on my radar for a while now. And I decided to speed this along because of the pandemic. So it's like April 10th or so. So people have been sequestered, quarantined, sheltered at home for quite a while right now. And in addition to me having 2 friends who have been informed by their partners that they want a divorce, there's starting to emerge some evidence. Everybody's focused on data rather than models right now, that the quarantine might not be good for every relationship. Mm-hmm. So there's some evidence out of China that the divorce rate increased post their quarantine, and there seems to be a rise, at least in the reporting of like domestic abuse and so on, that I've been hearing grumblings about, which is obviously incredibly concerning.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk about divorce because we have single listeners who are maybe single for now, but eventually want to get married. I actually have some married listeners. I don't know if their partners know that they listen. And then, of course, I have divorce listeners. And so I think your expertise are relevant to each of those. But before we get into it, let's talk about your transition from divorce lawyer to mediator.
Okay.
That's something that you've done rather recently. How long? Tell people a little bit about you.
I'm still a divorce lawyer. I'm still a lawyer. I operate mainly as mediator or as consulting attorney in mediations. That's my bread and butter. I do not litigate anymore. So I did transition from litigation to what we call consensual dispute resolution.
Consensual dispute resolution. That's such a lawyerly thing to say. How and why? How did you go from being a litigator to a non-litigator?
Well, I've always loved mediation. I've always been a fan of consensual dispute resolution, alternative forms of dispute resolution, because especially in family law, the courts are a really awful place for people to be. Now, sometimes they're necessary places for people to be, but for the most part, if you can resolve your dispute in another way, it's going to be better for all parties involved. Nobody wins when they go into court, even the winners.
So when you say an awful place to be, do you mean because of this, it becomes really zero sum and so on, or is it just because it's like an awful place to spend a day?
I think it's an awful place for families to be in particular, because family law, families it's a living beast. So, you may win a motion. It's like winning the battle, but not the war. There's no end. Even, if you're dealing with a case where there are children involved and the kids are, let's say 2 and 3 when the case starts, and maybe 4 and 5 when the case ends, and that's if you're lucky and the case goes through pretty quickly, it's not over, because there are changes of circumstances, and you may find yourself back in court literally for decades until the kids age out of the jurisdiction of the court, or support ends and there's no more jurisdiction on all matters. And then what happens is, even when the court no longer has a say over the decisions that are affecting and impacting your life, you still have to live. If there are children involved, you still have to live and be dealing with this other person in all forms for the rest of your life when we're talking about co-parents. So there's if you can't get to a place where you can start to make decisions together and change the paradigm of your communications, then you're sort of stuck in this breakup for the rest of your life.
And I think the idea, please correct me if I'm wrong. So first of all, I'm going to tell you the limits of my knowledge.
Okay.
A, child of divorce. So I went through this as the child. I don't know, maybe I was 9-ish when it all kind of really, really went down. I'm amazed that my parents stayed together that long. It was obviously really traumatic, and it was ugly.
I'm so sorry.
Although I can say this, I'm glad my parents divorced. They should have divorced. But it made for a very difficult childhood for me, and it was devastating to both of them. Like the two of them never really quite recovered. Neither had, I think, any real sort of, and certainly my mom never had any real meaningful, loving relationship with a man after that. And my father had one woman, I think, involved in his life who I got to meet, but otherwise, it was really bad. And the kids, we became pawns. It was nasty. Now, then my other experience is I have a very close friend who's been through divorce, and it's become at times rather adversarial. And then the last thing is I took a sport in the law class in college. So that's been my my exposure to understanding the law. And so, but this idea of this kind of adversarial view of law or foundation of law seems to make sense for a lot of things. But it sounds like when it comes to divorcing, it's not a really great model.
It's not a great model, and it's something that sort of feeds the worst of circumstances in a really negative way, right? If we have an adversarial model and you take two people from an emotional place, so these aren't contract. I mean, it is a contract, but these aren't. These
are cold business relationships,
right? These are personal, heated. My mom always said there's a fine line between love and hate. And I think that's true. And then you put people in this fine line between love and hate, and then you stick them into a system that is adversarial in nature. When you serve somebody with your summons and petition for divorce in this state,
you're in California.
In California, the first line on the summons says you have been sued. And it's the same as anything else. So, people get served and they get formally served with this paperwork sometimes before the other person has even told them they're not happy in the relationship.
Yes, that's brutal. You've been sued.
You've been sued.
Also, and I mean, I think we have to state this, and I'm sure it'll come up again, there's this idea in economics called the principal agent problem. Essentially, anytime you hire someone to do a job, the worry is that the person cares more about their interest than your interest. Mm-hmm. And it's just a comment, whether it be hiring a contractor to fix up your house, or a doctor to treat you, or whatever it might be. One of the challenges.
This is leading into a lawyer joke. Is that where we're going with this?
I wish it was. If I was better at my job, I would have researched a really solid lawyer joke, because I know lawyers love a good lawyer joke. Do you have one right now?
No. I just feel like, okay, so what are we talking about? The big bad lawyers who are.
Well, the concern is that because of the nature of the payment, which might either be, you get paid by the hour, or you get paid by a percentage. Either of those can create a situation where a lawyer is interested in aggravating the process, right? Drawing it out and so on, because of the potential profits for the lawyer. Am I incorrect in that?
I think that's a valid concern that has been raised, that most people have, except for the fact with family law, you don't get paid in terms of a percentage.
But it's hourly.
That's right. It's hourly. I think there are different structures that people are looking at. I don't know anyone who's doing, flat fee litigation, but it's hourly. So you look at, okay, are the lawyers motivated to do things quickly if they're getting paid by the hour? Mm-hmm. But the flip side of that is there's responsibilities of the lawyers. So it's not just about, making the money. It's also about protecting ourselves from potential malpractice by doing everything and anything that we can. And anything and everything costs a lot of money. And
that makes sense. Yeah, that's good. I'm sensitive to the transition you've made. So let's talk a little bit about that, because you were one of those lawyers who had to litigate and had to make sure that everything was covered and so on. How did you get into that? Also, you're Canadian. You were trained in Canada. This is a bit of a tangent, but I think does Canada treat divorces differently than the United States?
Yes,
Of course they do.
The laws are different, but the issues are very much the same. And, a lot of it is really a different means to get to very similar results in most respects.
Okay.
So, child custody law is pretty much exactly the same. Division of property is treated differently in Canada, or in, Toronto, Canada. We have a system based on equalization of net family property. And here it's a community property state. But if you were to break it down, it's very, very similar. Okay. It's just a different formulaic approach.
Are Canadians more polite about their divorces than Americans?
I will say, going to court.
This is such a stereotypical joke question.
I will say that not in terms of the litigants or the disputants, but in terms of the litigators, the litigation bar in Canada, I've noticed some real differences. But Canada's a different beast. I when I went to court in Ontario, I wore the full robe with the little tabs on them. You called the other lawyer, you would shake their hands. Not now because of coronavirus. Yes. You would shake their hand. You would call them my friend. You would refer to the judge as my honor, or your honor, and it has a different decorum than you would see in the courts here.
It feels more British in that way.
It's sort of in between American and British. The first time I left a California courthouse, I walked out backwards and bowed. And the judge sort of looked at me like I was crazy.
That's hilarious. Okay, so you were doing this in Canada, and then what changed? How'd you end up in California running Wineston Mediation?
Oh, well, I like to tell people that I was chasing my Hollywood dream, right? So I came here. I think I've told you this before, but I was talking to my husband one day, and he, you're talking about sort of my life's ambition. I said I wanted to do mediation, and he said, well, why don't you do that? And I said, well, I'll do it, but first I have to practice for another 20 years, maybe become a judge. And then on my way to retirement, I'll become a mediator. And that was really, that has been the path for a lot of people. And he said, well, that's stupid. There's got to be another way. So the idea is you kind of cut your teeth, you make your money, you eventually kind of, before you totally grind yourself into the ground, you downshift into mediating prior to retirement. Is that sort of it's a newer field. I mean, newer meaning 30 years. It's not brand new, but it's newer compared to other forms of dispute resolution. And I think California in particular is really progressive in terms of the mediation industry and very open to innovation and new generations of mediators. And it's not to say that Canada isn't. I think in Canada, we're a little bit more reserved in changing things. And so then that's when you pivoted and went to Pepperdine. Yes. So I went to Pepperdine so that I thought, if I'm going to try this thing at a younger age and, an earlier point in my career, I need some credentials behind me, and Pepperdine has or had the #1 rated program in the country, and there just wasn't anything equivalent anywhere else. I say that, and I will say that I now teach family mediation at USC, and they have an excellent program as well. There we go. That's a free shout out. And if I may ask, what does your husband do? Is he not an attorney? He's not an attorney. He's in real estate, but he actually works with attorneys. So he does real estate transactions in divorce cases and in estate and trust transactions. All right. Well, it sounds like his kind of authentic reaction to the status quo has proved useful for you. Yes. That's great. And also, as a partner, it helps that I'm assuming then he supported you in that transition because he knew that was going to be something that would be good for you. Yeah, I think he's just a little bit crazy, to be honest. That's great. We sold our house. We took our 2-year-old with us and moved to another country to try it out and see what would happen. Oh, did the mediating thing lead you to come to California? I came to California to do the program at Pepperdine. I see. Okay. All right. I thought it had been the other way. You came to California and then you're like, okay, let me go to this program. Neat. So let's people I'm sure are just chomping at the bit to find out a little bit more about this. So I mentioned these 3 groups of people who you can help. No pressure, Jennifer. Advice for solos who may get married eventually, married people who may be considering divorce or not, and then divorced people. And so what I'd like to do, if I may, is to talk about sort of general advice that you would give to anyone at any time, with the usual caveats. This is not paid legal advice, and so on. And then any specific advice you would give that's pandemic related. Okay. All right. So who do you want to start with? You tell me. Do you want to talk about? I'm good with any. You tell me. Let's work backwards. Let's start with the people who are currently divorced. They've been through either mediation or the typical, or I don't know. What's the breakdown in California of percentage of people who do mediation versus the sort of traditional litigation? Oh, I don't know. I couldn't tell you a stat. But is it 50-50? Is it 20? Is it 90-10? Like, is it? I don't know if it's tracked at all, so
Okay.
I really couldn't tell you. With actually, it probably someone's tracking it somewhere, but I really couldn't tell you. I know that mediation is gaining a lot of ground,
I can see that.
and the courts have been, especially recently, very, very supportive of mediation. So, when you start your case, there's a little box that you check that says, I'm considering or I'm going to be mediating these
Hmm.
issues or the entire case.
If I remember correctly, Colorado requires you to try to mediate first before you do it. Like there's like a stepwise kind of thing. I could be wrong about that.
I don't know about Colorado. In California, there's mandatory mediation for custody matters. So the first time custody is an issue in your case, before you proceed to hearing, you have a free, I think it's about 1 to 2 hours with a court mediator. And how that's handled in the different venues is a little bit different. In Canada, it was really interesting. We were having mediation, or we do have mediation, mandatory mediation in a lot of areas except family law.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, well, let's talk about the folks who are divorced. Now, one of the things that I found striking, I'm not sure this ended up happening in my parents' case. Obviously, that was a long time ago. But the need for divorced people to sometimes have to go back to court to resolve things that either are kind of unspecified or changes in circumstances and so on. So I guess my question is if you're a divorced person, do you have any general advice, and do you have any pandemic specific advice?
The general advice is to try to resolve your case before going to court, especially now if we're talking about the pandemic. I think there are a lot of changes of circumstances we're going to see. The courts are closed right now, except 2 matters that are urgent. And so they're going to be overrun. I think we can anticipate that the court dockets are going to be overloaded with cases that have been laying in wait, and new cases that unfortunately are likely to result from, being stuck in the house with your spouse.
Where things might have been a little tenuous before.
Yeah. So anything people can do to try to resolve it themselves, either directly, there's a spectrum of dispute resolution. You can, at one end of the spectrum, you're sitting across the kitchen table and you're writing on a napkin and you're working it out and you're figuring out what issues need to be addressed and how you want to resolve those issues. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you go to court and you go to trial and a judge makes the decision for you. And then in the middle, there's a wide range of options for you. And mediation sort of centers somewhere along the middle, closer to the kitchen table approach, which is really just a facilitated negotiation. So you have someone helping you have those conversations and work it out.
Yeah, and so if I understand correctly, there's a difference between a mediator and an arbitrator or an arbiter?
Yes, an arbitrator.
An arbitrator is involved in making a decision, but a mediator is about facilitating a decision. Is that the correct way to say that?
Yes. So in mediation, the parties make the decision, the people make the decision, and the mediator helps them get there, helps broker the deal, essentially. An arbitrator is someone who is essentially a private judge.
Got it.
So they make the decision, but it's not in the public realm.
I see. And so as a mediator, to what degree, or, sort of hypothetically, you or a mediator kind of help? I'm trying to think of someone like sort of a good mediator as helping people get an idea of boundaries, get an idea that they're maybe being unreasonable. Like you're not making a choice for anyone, but to be able to sort of, with some, I'm trying to think of the right word.
Some evaluation, some direction.
Yeah, I'm thinking of I'm thinking of, it's late. I'm not at my best at late at night, but the idea is that you sort of can smooth and be like, well, in my experience, you're being an asshole. You know what I mean? Like that kind of, like you're being unreasonable.
So there are different
where a mediator does that, no?
Yeah, there are different styles of mediation, and experienced mediators will generally use different styles at different times. So a facilitative approach is more of a helper approach and really putting all of the autonomy on the parties. And then as you move across the spectrum, I'm using my hands and I realize that no one can see them. But as you move across the spectrum, then you get to a more directive or evaluative approach where a mediator might say something like, this is what the law might say on this. This is what might happen if you go to court. Knowing that, how do you want to handle it? Retired judges, when I talked about, practicing for another 20 years, then becoming a judge and then seeing mediation on my way to retirement, retired judges tend to be more directive and evaluative, which makes sense because they have that to offer parties. Whereas non-retired judge mediators tend to be more facilitative and evaluative when needed. And then there are different types of mediators. There might be mental health professional mediators. A lot of mediators are attorneys. There are financial professionals who will mediate certain aspects of a case. So there are all types of professionals, and depending on their expertise, they may become more evaluative, more directive in certain areas.
Okay, so I'm going to ask this question now, even though we've digressed, and that is, how do you find a good mediator? So it sounds to me that all things equal, you should try mediation as a first step, unless there's some extraordinary circumstance. But how do you go about finding a mediator as a couple?
There are a lot of resources. Like anything, there are online resources and tools. There are, asking for referrals from friends, from other professionals, people who've gotten divorced. And
just put it on Facebook. Hey, getting divorced. I need a good mediator.
Well, you see a lot of that coming up. I mean, I'm on different, mom forums and my Facebook groups. I'm getting a lot of information from people saying, gosh, my husband's making me crazy in this quarantine. What do I do? So, there are a lot of resources. There are organizations that can help you make your choice. But essentially the most important thing to do, because a mediator has to be, it's like an invited guest to the dinner table. You want to make sure that you like them, that you have rapport with them, especially in family law. I mean, you're putting all of your dirty laundry on the table. You're coming at a time when you're very vulnerable, speaking about things that, you may not have told anyone in your life. And you have to feel comfortable with the person. And then you want to meet with them and interview them like anyone else that you're choosing as a professional who's going to deal with important things in your life. You want to interview them and make sure that their philosophies, their style of mediation is on par with what your expectations are.
I think this is really interesting. I have a previous episode on how to choose a therapist. I actually think that some of the advice that was given in the episode of how to choose a therapist is exactly the same advice that you would use to choose a mediator.
And what was that? How was that?
A lot of it is that idea of that you actually want to meet with them, and you just want to see, does their style feel right to you?
Right.
Obviously there's a prior step to that, which is to figure out, do they have the right kind of, in the case of therapists, do they have the right sort of orientation for your particular problem? That may be less so there, but at least stylistically, it sounds to be the case. I
mean, I think that's true for mediation as well, especially since, I've told you that there are different professionals who will mediate. So it's not only attorney mediators. There are issues where, if there are really complex custody issues, you may prefer a mental health professional to mediate those issues.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
You go to an attorney mediator or someone else to draft it up. Or sometimes these mental health professional mediators will also draft up these elaborate custody plans, and those are important.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk about it. So the first thing I heard you saying for our divorce listener is, in general, but more than ever now because of the pandemic, if you have a conflict, you have a custody conflict, you have, I think there's like these things about, well, there's nothing in our contract about vacations. How this hasn't been covered. There's a conflict around this, whatever that might be. Maybe someone gets thrown out of work. It might change something like child support or alimony and so on. are you allowed to call it alimony anymore? I'm not sure.
Spousal support, alimony.
Spousal support it sounds less of a dirty word than alimony. The your first piece of advice is try to work it out, because it's not going to get worked out fast anyways, and it's going to be costly to get it worked out.
And there aren't a lot of options available to people right now, and right now everyone is in crisis, including the mediators and lawyers, by the way. We're all sort of living through this crisis, and there aren't a lot of options available, and the issues are novel. So, if you go to a lawyer and you say, my ex is working in the hospitals and he gets the kids on the weekends, and I'm now, my 75-year-old father is now living with us. What would a judge do? I don't know that the lawyers will be able to tell you. Not that they ever really could tell you definitively, but we're living in novel times, and we don't know how the courts are going to deal with all of these issues ultimately. So, when I talked about a facilitative approach, you really are in an area where, in a time and in issues that you and your partner are going to be best suited to make these decisions together. No one else is going to be able to tell you what's right.
I see.
People all over the world right now are taking the guidelines and doing different things with them, right?
I see.
There's a huge range.
I get it. So I think that, I have to imagine it just has to be so difficult, as you said, even if you're not married anymore. And, I have friends who are divorced. I know divorced people, and it's the full range of relationships with their exes, from they're friends with their ex, to they have to meet in a church parking lot, and the kid walks from one car to the other car, and there's some supervisor of some sort there. You know what I mean? It's it's got to be just awful, just absolutely awful. And so I think that advice of if you can work it out, you're the best people to work it out, right? There's but what if you can't, right? So what if you are in that situation that it's just ugly? Is there some sort of stopgap measure? Is there someone you could turn to? Someone like if I was in that situation, could I call you? If assuming my ex is on, this imaginary ex, I've never been divorced, but was on board with that to work this out via Zoom. Are you doing Zoom?
Yes. Yes. Everything is via, an online video conferencing or conference calls. And really this is one of the options, one of the only options I think that's available to help people resolve their disputes. Ultimately, the people are still in charge of the decisions, but mediators are trained and skilled at helping people get there.
Do you think that this is going to cause a bit more of a surge in the use of mediators? If you shut down the courts, and it sounds like you guys are the only viable option for the people who can't work it out themselves.
I think so. I think this is going to make mediation more of a necessity than it's been viewed in the past. There are private judges available. The courts are still obviously available in emergency circumstances. They will reopen again. Some of the courtrooms are moving to, remote platforms as well. So everything is changing, and it's changing every day. So it's not that people are without access to justice. Not at all. It's just,
So it's just slower justice than normal.
It's a slower justice, and it's still just as expensive as it was at a time when the economy has been greatly impacted already from all of this. And that's a big factor as well.
Yeah, it has to be. Certainly, what little I know about divorce, it seems to be the case that financial problems are a major cause for divorce. And so, and then obviously, if you have less resources, it's sort of an interesting paradox. People are predicting the divorce rate that's going to increase as a result of this for the reasons that are obvious. The other one is, well, not with a financial crisis necessarily can people afford to get divorced, right? That's the, divorce can be a great destroyer of wealth. And if you've just lost a bunch of wealth because of the stock market and job prospects, that may keep people together in a way that might be unhealthy too.
But support, child support, spousal support, these are huge, not just for people who are getting divorced or want to get divorced, but for people who are already divorced, where there are support orders or agreements in place. There are changes of circumstances daily right now, and they're significant. People's incomes are being cut entirely or cut in half, and that necessitates immediate relief on their obligations sometimes. So
I see.
When I say the courts are going to be overloaded, it's just it's everyone coming back.
Yeah, that's right. So anything else that comes to mind in terms of folks who are divorced and in this circumstance?
I think the most important thing is for people to be interest-based in their approach. So, everyone is so on high alert and anxious about everything. It's really hard to communicate when you're communicating from a position of crisis. And if you can, take a few deep breaths and communicate what your interests are, what's behind the request you're making, it's going to be received in a better way than demands.
Yes, I can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah. The is there, one of the things that I think comes up a lot is how you go about communicating. That is the medium, right? So, you have text, you have calls, you have email, you have face-to-face, you now have Zoom suddenly. It's becoming a more normative thing to do. Do you have any advice about how to have, I can see the pros and cons of writing something out in order to get the precision, but then you lack the emotion. And sometimes that can be good, but sometimes that can be bad. Do you have any instincts about when you're communicating those needs, the right way to go about doing it?
It really depends. It depends on the dynamic between the people and their sophistication when it comes to writing things out or talking things through. There are a lot of really good resources for people, like online tools that will messaging tools for divorced people, for co-parents. And some of them even have these little tone meters that when they're getting too crazy, maybe they may want to revise it. I really particularly I always refer people to this book called Biff, and it's written by Eddie, who is BIFF. And Bill is the founder of the High Conflict Institute, and he has some really, really great resources. Biff is his approach to responding to a hostile communication, and it has to be brief, informative, friendly, and firm. And then there are 5 or 6 other things that you'll learn from reading about Biff responses. And I find it really, really useful as a resource for clients who maybe are dealing with someone who's more high conflict on the other side, or just in terms of personality, or just in terms of circumstance, to help them to respond and to de-escalate that conflict.
Yeah, that's good. That's nice advice. I have a particular bias against text. I say you should use text for making plans and flirting. Okay. And obviously, when you're divorced, it's just for making plans. So unless you want to go well. So okay, let's talk. We've been dancing around kind of advice and thinking about the needs of married people who might be in crisis or might be considering. This has to be, kind of it's such a huge decision to make, especially when there are children involved. So it can't be something that's made lightly, in the same way that getting married shouldn't be a decision that's made lightly for this very reason. What are some of the things that, as I said, in general or specific to the pandemic, that comes to mind for these folks who are very likely spending even more time together than they would otherwise?
I think safety first. So there are a lot of resources available to people. I don't know if domestic violence instances are increasing, but I imagine that they are because of because it's a time of such high stress.
Mm-hmm. And just simply, if you're in the same place as the person more often,
right,
the likelihood of things going sideways just goes up for that, even without all the other emotional challenges that are being presented right now.
And there's less support available. People aren't out on the street. People aren't around as much and available to you physically. So, safety first. People need to get out of an unsafe situation, and there are resources that continue to be made available to help them with that. If they're in a situation where they've been thinking about divorce for some time and this quarantine is just throwing them over the edge and they're saying, I can't spend another day with this person, I would caution them against telling them necessarily, unless they think that it will help to de-escalate the issues. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just cathartic for both parties and they're on the same page. But if you think that telling your spouse that you want a divorce in the middle of a quarantine where there's no end in sight is going to make things more difficult, then it might be better to sort of keep it to yourself and get your ducks in a row. So it's a really great opportunity to figure out your finances, figure out how things are structured, cost, what your expenses are, what the other person's income is. You can do some research and homework. Everything's housed somewhere in your vicinity, hopefully. And you can start to research the different dispute resolution methods that are available, processes that are available to you, and how it all works, so that when you are ready to make that decision and tell the other person, you're more prepared to do so.
Yeah, I have to say I have zero training in this and I have zero experience in this. So I'm going to ask, but I'll tell you an anecdote and you can give me a grade on the quality of my advice. Okay. So I had someone who called me one day and said that she had made the decision that she was going to divorce her spouse. Okay. And I wasn't surprised by that. I knew enough about their relationship, their ups and downs. There were some children involved. And I said, okay. I didn't congratulate her or anything like that. I just said, okay. I didn't try to talk her out of it, anything like that. I just said, okay. And I said, how are you going to do this? And she said, I think I'm going to tell him on Saturday. And I said, does he have any idea? And she says, I don't think so. I've just decided this. And I said, you cannot walk into the living room and drop this bomb on this guy. I think you're unprepared for it. He's unprepared for it. And you're risking setting up a situation where you have a man who probably doesn't, my assumption was he didn't want it to happen. And you're setting up a situation where he's just going to fight you all the way through this. He's going to be hurt. He's going to feel betrayed. He's going to X, Y, and Z. And to her credit, she said, okay, well, what should I do? And so, I was spitballing at that point. I said, I think you need to see a therapist, to make an appointment with a therapist, someone that you can connect with and feel comfortable with. I think you need to talk to a financial person, some financial planner, ideally fee-based. I have a podcast about fee-based financial planners and how much I love them. I think you should be talking to a lawyer or some other expert in the field just to figure out the state that you live in, what are the norms and what are the practices and what is it going to look like. And then after you do that, then you have to have a conversation with him in which you say, listen, this is not working. It's not working for me. I'm not happy. I know you're not happy. And I think we need to explore, a separation or, and this kind of stuff. And then offer him some joint counseling with a different therapist just to work through, again, the problems that were leading to this divorce, not just to help them manage divorce and so on. And to her credit and to his credit, she did those things. They did those things. They ended up, if I can recall correctly, doing mediation as a result of it. And I think both generally behaving like, holding themselves to kind of high standards and making it, it was difficult, but making it a good process, so to speak. All right. So do I get a B+ or what?
You get an A+. I mean, successful outcome, and that's great. That was great advice.
Okay. What did I miss? Like, so my next friend who's getting, when my friends tell me they're getting divorced, I tell them to change their passwords. That's my first advice now. Is that terrible? That's terrible.
No, that's always a good idea. Especially if they're going to be communicating with lawyers.
I say it in a joking way, and then I go, but I'm absolutely serious. Change your password.
Yeah, so, and to make sure they have finances available in their own name. I mean, there are a bunch of things that they can do to be protective of themselves. But I think essentially, and what I hear from the advice that you told your friend is how you start matters. How you do this before you do it. Think about it a little bit, because how you do it matters, and it will impact not just the tone of the start or the course of the thing. It will impact the result, the ultimate result, how people start.
I agree. I mean, getting served with "you are being sued" is not the way this should start. It should start.
But that's the standard form. I mean, we can't do it.
I understand. I know. But what I'm saying is, like, if you start with "I am really struggling," you know what I mean, and I know you are too, right? Has a way different feel than, "Hey, Joe, this isn't working. I want a divorce." Like, that's just. So is there anything you would add to either my reaction to that situation or sort of in general? Anything else?
The only thing that, I don't think there's anything really to add, but the only thing is when this person is speaking with her therapist, to talk about and get some guidance on a script and timing in terms of how she's going to relay this information to her spouse, and then together when they're working with the mental health professional to talk about a script and timing in terms of how they're going to relay this information to the children.
Yeah, I was going to say that's what I was just about to ask that. Like, I think that the kind of classic thing is you tell the children, my parents said this to us, is like, this isn't your fault. This doesn't have anything to do with you. It's mommy and daddy, kind of a thing. There's got to be something else than that for kids. No? Yes?
I think you give them the information that they can handle based on their age and stage of development. And I think that the most important piece of it is to practice it together beforehand. If you're in a situation, if you're in a lucky enough situation where you can have the conversation together with your children, the mental health professionals say that is, you're so far ahead just by doing it together and just by being able to do that. But practice how you're going to respond to various questions. I think most people, the more prepared they are, they're almost underwhelmed by the children's responses. Sometimes they expected more questions, or they expected it to go worse than it ultimately does because they're prepared.
Yeah, that's great. I've never heard that advice about practicing those conversations together, but that makes sense. I also think one of the really nice things about that idea is, like, I do believe that you can be united in your pursuit of separation. That just because a relationship is ending, and look, I know it's disappointing. You made public vows, and there's these contractual issues, and frankly, it can be embarrassing and so on. But the idea that if you think of it as like, okay, we were in this together, our circumstances have changed, we can stay together and help each other out of it. It seems to me that one of the, obviously when it comes to splitting resources that causes hurt feelings and problems and fights. The other one is I have to imagine when one person wants it and the other person doesn't.
Yeah, that can be very, very difficult. And it becomes about, pace and readiness. And a mediation process or a collaborative process is more attuned to dealing with those types of dynamics than an adversarial process, because you're essentially, you're separating together. Like, you're doing the thing together, just like you got into the relationship together. You're going to get out of it together, which is more natural and dignified in most cases than, all of a sudden going from, a married partnership to adversaries, enemies.
Yeah.
On the other side
terrible.
of the table.
Okay, so the last group, my target market. No, that's not true. As I said, I have divorced listeners, and I'm happy that they're listeners and they're embracing their remarkable lives. But I have this saying for solo, which is to be single for now or forever, right? So you don't have to be a lifelong single person and know that you never want to get married. I think to be a listener, I have people who someday they want to be married, or they're open to it if the right person comes along. They just don't want to treat their single years as the way society often treats them, as this like in between transitional state where you're sort of less than. So I have solo listeners who have that open mind, may even have marriage as a goal in some way. What's good to know before you get married based upon your experience?
I have a colleague who always puts it this way, that, everyone has a prenup. It's just, you either you go and you get a prenup that sets out your specific intentions, or you're stuck with the statute, the law.
The state's prenup.
Yeah.
Everybody has a prenup. I like that. Everybody has a prenup. It's just whether it's yours or the state's.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I often tell people is all marriages end. All marriages. They just end in either death or divorce. So it's really important when you're entering into this contract, you know what the legal impact is in the event, when the marriage ends in either death or divorce. So go talk to an estate lawyer and talk to a family lawyer and get a little bit of advice about what it is that you're entering into. And then decide if there are any steps that you feel would be necessary to take so that you live the life you want to live, and that your intentions are set out as you go on this journey.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing I would do if I ever got married, which I don't think is going to happen. But that's I'm like, well, honey, I think we need to go talk to a state lawyer. I think we need to talk to a family lawyer. And any woman who would be crazy enough to want to marry me would be like, yeah, okay, you're a Pete, so we'll do that. But so then let's talk through this idea. I like this idea of like, okay, if you're going to be perfectly satisfied with the state's prenup, agreement, then that's fine. But maybe you aren't. Maybe you're not comfortable with that for some reason or another. That seems to be a sensitive conversation to have, especially if one person wants to have it and the other one doesn't want to have it.
Listen, it's not hugely romantic, but
Sure.
it is loving, right? Because it's a loving act to think about the future and to be able to communicate what your interests and wishes and desires are for the relationship.
I agree. By the way, I think it's perverse the amount of time, money, energy, efforts that are put into a wedding, and how little time, money, energy, effort is put into planning a marriage.
I agree. And and divorce is often, litigated divorce will be likely more expensive than that big extravagant.
Woo!
Right? So
That's painful. Yeah, I get it. Okay, so I think that's talk. Also, I think there's an interesting. So this is general advice. Clearly, this is not pandemic related advice. I can't wait to hear your pandemic related advice. But the idea is, I just have to imagine that going to your would-be life partner and saying, I'm 100% in, I want to marry you, you're great, you're wonderful, I love you, I think I want to get hitched, but I want to do this right, and so I want us to do these other things. I can imagine that if your partner's on the same page and goes through with it and sees these people, you know what I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you're probably better off as a result. Like, it's actually a leading indicator that you might not ever need them. I mean, well, you'll need one or the other is your point, but you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But if that process in and of itself causes conflict, strife, a challenge, that might be something to pay attention to.
Well, and I think it's something where, just like with divorce, how you start matters
Mm-hmm.
when you're talking about engaging in these kinds of discussions. So I'll see people often come to me and say, we're considering a prenuptial agreement. We're not really sure how to go about it, or, my family has money and his family doesn't, or her family doesn't. And, my parents or my in-laws want this document to be prepared. The traditional approach used to be that the person who had assets that they wanted to protect would go to their lawyer, prepare what it is that they want, and then bring it home and say, sign here, dear. And that approach is starting to change with these consensual dispute resolution processes, where people will enter into collaborative approaches, or go to a mediator, or go to collaborative attorneys together and have that initial meeting together where they both have representation,
Mm-hmm.
and talk about the high level points of what their intentions are. And then once an agreement is worked out, then they get it. Then they get it all drafted and prepared and sign it, and away they go.
Yeah, I like this saying of how you start matters. Yeah. I think a lot of things. I like to say that beginnings matter.
Yeah.
In general, I think I always try to keep that in mind. Beginnings matter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what about anything pandemic related? Like, I certainly know there are people who are planning weddings that are being postponed and so on. But even if you're thinking about marrying someone, is anything about the pandemic, should that be changing the way a person's thinking and behaving?
I don't marry someone that you wouldn't want to be quarantined with, right? you couldn't see being stuck in a room with for 3 months. I think that's a lesson that we're all gleaning from all of this. Mm-hmm. Marriage is hard. It's not easy. And relationships are hard. They're not easy. And they're hard when people have to be apart because of things like quarantine. And they're hard when people have to be together. To have and to hold in sickness and in health, and 24 hours a day for the next.
Yeah. I had someone, I don't know where I picked this up from, maybe even it was our little pre-interview, where someone was like, yeah, this is not in my vows. Right? Like, this isn't covered by the vows. I didn't sign up for this.
My husband?
It's very interesting in that way. I think that's solid advice. Like, I think, like, if you're really struggling with this quarantine in your relationship, mm-hmm. It should give you pause. I'm looking forward to the surge in listenership as a result of the quarantine, because I think there's going to be a lot of single people happening after this.
Yeah, or single hopefuls, people who are just dreaming.
Indeed, yes, that's right. Okay, this has been really fantastic. I wonder, is there any specific? This is a little bit. I think that obviously, when you think about marriages and you think about divorce, you think about a man and a woman. Obviously that's percentage-wise the highest percentage. But now gay couples in many places have access to marriage. I think it's really interesting, the fight for marriage rights for gay and lesbians because of all the spousal benefits that come with marriage. It has this sort of special place in society, whether it be wealth transfer from estates, medical decision making, and so on. So now there are gay and lesbians who are married. Is there anything special that comes up in your experience when the partners of the same sex, or no? Is everything still the same?
I mean, the issues are still the same. The laws are the same.
So it doesn't matter.
Not that I've noticed. I mean, every relationship is different, and people are unique and families are unique. I haven't noticed anything specific in terms of advice that I would give.
Yeah, I didn't think so either, but I wanted to ask just in case. I think the reason, is like there's sort of these sort of stereotypical ideas that you have, about divorce and men and women that come from this. Like, it's my understanding that women, for example, initiate divorce more often than men.
I believe that is still the statistic, but I'm not, I don't know that that's what I've seen in my practice necessarily.
Yeah, my guess is that you probably, given how progressive your practice is, you probably get a different slice of the population.
Possibly, and it's possible that people who are prone to mediation and more amicable
or more
forms of dispute
egalitarian
resolution
to begin with, or
or maybe they just don't find their way in the stats.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Okay, so what am I missing? I always do this. Whenever I have especially this is clearly outside my experience, beyond the ways that I talked about at the outset of this. What is it that I'm sure I'm going to return to this topic again because there's just so much to talk about. I know we're just glossing over lots of things, but is there anything that comes to mind that is you think is really important for any of those three groups? People considering, solos considering, married people considering, divorced people who are still having to interact?
One of the things I tend to tell people that I think is really, really important is the inclusion of some sort of mental health supports in the divorce process. And that's because people, we're best able to make decisions about process, decisions about resolution, decisions about what we want to do the next day and how we want to get up and move forward with our lives when we are thinking logically and when we are feeling strong and supported. And I think one of the reasons that divorce law can be so nasty and brutal and expensive and life draining for people, and it has such a negative and lasting impact in their lives, is because at the outset they maybe didn't have the right supports in place to help them along the way. So you can't make logical, reasonable decisions when you are in crisis and in the worst place you are in your life. You're not your best self. So I think that's really important, before going too far down that road, making sure you have proper supports in place, positive advocates, positive people who are there to support you and help you, as opposed to, sometimes well-meaning friends and families who are there to support you, but are not necessarily positive influences in terms of your goals.
Yeah, I think that's right. I have this concept of a team, for the single person, and that a therapist is, I think, oftentimes a critical. I don't think everybody needs a therapist in the same way that not everybody, needs to go to the doctor. But I think in general, it's good to have one on hand, especially to be able to make that call when things go sideways. And so I think when you're married, it's important to have mental health support.
Absolutely.
In general, and actually having that mental health support may help you avoid a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
Because a good therapist is going to not only provide an outlet, but also is going to help you develop skills to help with communication, help with your own coping mechanism, helping reset your expectations, and so on. So I think that's outstanding. I think that's outstanding advice.
That's one thing I love about LA, and I have no idea if there are any stats on this or if this is even a true statement, but in my experience or my opinion, everyone in LA seems to have a therapist. There's no stigma attached. It's so common. It's seen as so necessary. And I come from Toronto, and I feel like nobody had one.
Yeah, well, look, LA has acupuncture for your dog, so if that's acceptable, then having a therapist certainly would be. But yeah, I think that's right. I think it's really healthy. It's why I talk about having a therapist, as a man especially. That I think it's important and as an older man, I think it's important for younger men to hear that I have a therapist. I'm not embarrassed about it. It's provided me great value in my life in terms of improving my happiness, my relationships.
When I was at Pepperdine, the most impactful course that I took, and I mentioned Bill Eddy, he was my professor of the class that was called The Psychology of Conflict. And I was completely flabbergasted that this wasn't a required course. I was, 9 years almost 10 years, I think, from finishing law school the first time around when I did my master's, and I took the psychology of conflict. And I feel like, isn't that required when we're dealing with people in conflict? And I learned more in that one course than, I took more away from that than I did in, a decade of my legal career. It was so insightful.
Yeah, I think that's great. I have one last question, then I promise to let you go. So, there's sort of two different types of couples. There's like the couples who become really very insulated. We've all had a good friend who they meet someone and then they disappear into that relationship. And sometimes you never get them back. They're just gone forever. It's changed forever. And then sometimes a breakup or a divorce happens and then they're back. You're their first call, And I try, when I was a younger man, I would resent that. I really would, because I would grieve. I would lose someone who was very close to me. But I learned, I never wanted to hold it against them. Like I wasn't going to punish them when they made that call, reaching back out, because I care about them, and nothing material had changed in terms of my affection for them. The other type of couple are they're bonded, but they also have, call it enough of, I like to call it a solo mentality, where they still remain connected beyond their relationship. I think that those folks do better when it comes to a divorce, obviously, right? Because they already have people that they can kind of rely on, and they can kind of transition back into single life in a way that I think is less bumpy. For those people in the former, the folks who disappeared, who went into this, this insulated partnership, in your experience, do you have any advice for how they should go about sort of, for lack of a better term, negotiating, re-entering, friendships and even family connections and so on in light of a divorce?
I've never thought about it quite that way, but it would go back to, seeking supports. I mean, when people are getting divorced, they're essentially negotiating for their new identity. I mean, it's so tied to who people are, their relationships. I think it's really important to find those supports. I think it's important to dispel any taboos with respect to divorce, and not to feel that isolation that I think people often feel, especially if they're the ones who aren't the divorce seekers, right? So, maybe they were blindsided, they may be embarrassed by it, they may not want to seek out friendships and support right away.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really important to do that, because otherwise they may be negotiating from a weaker position in terms of their negotiating power, because they're feeling so down and out. And that's one of the reasons they need to feel strong and be ready to engage in these, really important financial and personal decisions that are going to impact the rest of their life.
Yeah, I agree. That's great advice. I think I would say this: you're likely losing, a support system, and if you don't have one to replace it. Mm-hmm. One of the best places to replace it is with the people you were close with beforehand.
Sure.
And if those people truly are good family members and good friends, they're going to welcome you back with open arms. Plus, Jennifer, these people need me, because the dating world has changed since they got married.
Mm-hmm. The dating world has changed in the last 3 weeks.
Yes, indeed. And so they need someone who's going to be like, yeah, I got to walk you through it. There's this thing called ghosting, for example. You're going to got to get used to it, because it didn't exist before you got married.
Yeah, that happens in marriages too, believe it or not.
Oh my God, it's terrible. Yeah. Well, Jennifer, you're really great. This was, I first of all, for the listeners, they don't know this, we had a couple failed attempts. So I really appreciate your patience and your stick-to-itiveness for this, because I think the advice that you give, your experience, is really useful for folks, given the gravity of these kinds of decisions, given how emotionally challenging relationships are, breakups are, divorces are. And I also think it's really helpful for people to know that there are really kind of good alternatives to the kind of traditional litigation route. And so I say this tongue in cheek, but I hope you get lots and lots of clients because of this podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
That's great. Okay, thanks again.
All right.
Welcome back for some bonus material about the divorce rate. What exactly does the divorce rate mean? People talk about 40% of marriages, 50% of marriages end in divorce. Well, I've always puzzled over that. It never seems to kind of gel with my experience with married couples. Now, of course, I don't have a representative experience, but nonetheless, never seemed right. Well, it's complicated. So the divorce rate is determined by comparing the number of marriages in a year to the number of divorces in a year. So recently, that number was 6.8 marriages per 1,000 people in the United States, and 3.2 divorces per 1,000 people. Right? You can see how that number starts to get you closer to 50%. Now, that should sound a little strange to you, I think. So those are not an apples-to-apples comparison, right? We're not comparing the people who are married to the people who are getting divorced. Moreover, those numbers are imprecisely reported across states. And states are the arbiters of divorce. And so in that way, there's some imprecision with that number to begin with. One interesting thing is that those numbers both have been decreasing for the last 30 years. So both the rate of divorce and the rate of marriage per 1,000 people have been going down. Now, the much better number, the one that you would probably want to know if you were getting married, is what is the probability that my marriage, will end in divorce? Now, to get that number, you have to look at the data longitudinally, of which the data aren't as good and well reported. And then there's some issues with that. So, for example, that probability changes over time. So, for example, you can do this thought experiment. The probability that someone gets divorced the day after their marriage is really quite low. And so there's some non-linearity there in which the probability of divorce starts to accelerate and then at some point starts to decelerate. That is, 75-year-old couples, they don't tend to get divorced. They've been together for so long. And so that number's even more complicated because not everybody has the same probability. For example, highly educated, highly wealthy people are less likely to have divorces also. There's less stress in those marriages, for example. So what is that probability? Well, that's difficult to say. My research suggests that it's as low as 25%, but probably not higher than 45%. We could split the difference and say around 35%. I wouldn't want you to hold me to that number, but let's just say that number is lower than the divorce rate that's typically cited in the media or around the dinner table at a dinner party. I'll put some information in the exhibits about this. Certainly has been a little bit of fascinating research on my side. I certainly will say this, is even with that lower probability, it still seems rather high given the cost of divorce, right? When you think about the emotional, psychological, and certainly financial costs of divorce, the fact that 1 out of 3, for example, marriages may end eventually in a divorce state is something that can't be ignored. Okay, well, thanks for listening this long. This was a super fascinating conversation with Jennifer Wineston. I don't think you have to have been married or be married or even contemplate being married to find it fascinating. As someone who's not interested in getting married, it certainly has reinforced some of my beliefs. Please keep telling your friends, family, and colleagues about the podcast. It's continuing to grow, mostly through word of mouth. Thanks again for listening. Take care. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life.